Okay, so we've done build up of the mannequin of the figure, and then I've worked through a little bit of adjusting that process to tap into and connect with different body types. This is from the first Avengers movie, the one that was directed by Josh Whedon and has the Hulk in my favorite, it's my favorite depiction at least, where he's very kind of monstrous and kind of almost primate like. And so, if you want to do studies like this on your own, one thing you could think about is maybe do a little silhouette or thumbnail sketch, which I'm going to put up here in the top right. So it's my little thumbnail. That would be what are the key forms that align this character with a specific body type? So is it that I'm seeing a lot or feeling a lot of squares in this body, or triangles or spheres? Does it fall in line with a specific archetype? Hulk is definitely a brute, so I would see that as my overall, what I'm aiming for. The genre would be a brute for sure. So let's say, I know that the brute is always top heavy, so maybe I'll start to think of that or look for that in terms of the Hulk's stature. He really does have that kind of fuller top, and then it does taper a bit here. So I'm starting to get a sense of the shapes. Maybe some triangles that are positioned like that, squarer, shorter head. The legs are really broad. So maybe I do a really brief sketch, again, a little thumbnail or a silhouette, something that you might use to find an early comfortability with a character in this type of pose. Or maybe you might look at it in terms of what geometric language says this, or what qualities would say this. How would I exhibit an animalistic feel in terms of a drawing by way of character? What I notice in this one that I talk about different in a different class or more anatomy is that there's a lot of imperfection that's used really wonderfully in this type of character, where there's underbite and chipped teeth and skin that feels irregular and pocked, and stature and pose that feels imperfect or normal even in the anatomy and its arrangement or the stance. Whereas, the later iterations of the Hulk in film, almost undoes this progressively. So in the next movie that we see him in Thor Ragnarok, he basically has the form, language, and behavior of a toddler, where he's kind of walking around and fighting Thor, and then complaining at the end about, me fight monster, baby talk. And then we see his skin get better, his teeth get fixed, his haircut a little bit more faded. But he starts to move in terms of posture and attitude kind of into the realm of toddler. And then from there he becomes Smart or Professor Hulk, which returns him to kind of a vertical posture, a bit more of an elegance or an intelligence to him, where it's almost like the evolution of man from ape to baby to somebody that's something like a college professor type. So that would be a way that I would thumbnail. And then again, I'm always looking in terms of trying to understand a sequence or context. So what's the head shape? Well, the tilt is this. Here's the head. I'm going to make it a little bit shorter and squarer. There's things that I notice about this that I'm going to try to avoid looking at or representing for now that would be really nice to point out later in terms of the skull and its shape and the way it communicates a certain animalistic quality. But that's the part. Its position by way of turn and tilt, and then its perspective, which is that I'm underneath it. Here's the neck. So let's make this side stretch. So that's a little longer. Let's make this side pinch. So there's my shape there. And then I need to make that much bigger. So I'm going to start to incorporate that shape of the neck into the trap here. So here's our big shape. Let's let that drop a bit here. And then now I'm into my torso. So shoulder tilt is this. Let's give some wrapping lines to neck. And then what's the torso as a whole doing? So torso in this case, gesture back. I say we have a little bit of a lean forward. Here's that center line. I'm tracking this line here. And then I can broaden that a little bit to this side. And then I'm going to make this more of a C. I want that hunch to be really clear. And then where does that pelvis end? I think that's ending right in this area. The basic perspective maybe is just slightly under. As we move into the pelvis, probably still underneath. Here's our clavicle, our area of that tilt. But I'm trying to bring over all of these concerns. These would be the basic shapes. I'm still trying to keep that in my back pocket as far as how things are being modified. And then for this here, as I go through and do the lay-in, I'm just expanding my shape to reflect that. right? Whereas in the earlier ones that were more conservative in terms of the figures being depicted, these were more narrower or more reflective of the proportion in the parts of the body. So now let's work into our legs. So pelvis is here. So this would be more of our arrow shape, but this is a pretty thick shape. So I'm just going to broaden that out. It's going this way. And then I lose some of that foot at the bottom, but that's a pretty fat leg. Here's the back leg. So you want a lay-in that's generic enough to start where you can play around with distorting and moving these things. It doesn't have to be perfect. There's my back foot. And then the goal in this will be that we try to bring it toward seeing if the anatomy can also play with this. So here's the back of the arm. That covers a lot of this back torso. And then shorter arms. Fist would be kind of right in front of that pelvis area. His arms behind. So what am I looking for here now? I want to do the same thing. Does the body type and the pose kind of match? This character looks like it is off balance, or there's a play with balance that's maybe reflective of its psychology. If there is a balance, which there is, if I drop the pit of the neck down to the weight bearing leg, that's a way to find the balance. All of the forms of this character have a real dramatic relationship to that stability. Isn't that the story? That's kind of like the story of the Hulk theme, right? Is a kind of tenuous relationship to balance between Banner and Hulk. And then iterations or versions of this character explore different relationships to that balance. So Smart Hulk, Baby Hulk, now we're getting Red Hulk. It's all balances between maybe the rational and the irrational. So that's one way to go about this. We have our basic lay-in. Let's build on it. What I've also done is I give us these parts and a relative perspective to them. So let's remember we did like every part had a bit of a wrap, and that was just a way to play and develop a sensitivity to surface. But at some point I'm going to want to start to develop this past the lay-in. If this is just a mannequin or tool to explore body type, once I've done that, I'm going to want to start to put on top muscles and maybe move it toward a more realistic feeling for a drawing. And so now let's try to do that. So what might I start to do if I'm going to play with this one? I would say first thing is, so I'm going to do a quick pass, make sure all my forms are in the right place with the right perspective. I double check all my connections to make sure all those parts feel well fused together, welded together. I think that's always an important thing for me in terms of the triple check before I go into putting time into something, devoting some time to rendering or building muscle. Just want to make sure I don't have to move big parts later. On top of this, I'm kind of finding some forms, like thinking about where the rib cage form would be under there and trying to get that end point. So now it could be a pass of coming in and just putting some loose skeletal moments or landmarks in places. Doesn't mean you have to lose your place with contour or shape. I'm just trying to make sure that the bones register. Let's maybe play with addressing the parts. So I have a head shape that I've set up to look somewhat sympathetic to the Hulk as I see it. I've done the rest for the body. And now as we start to look at the individual parts, what could I do and think to bring more of a sense of finish to these? Well, the Hulk has really massive brows. So the Hulk is everything in terms of the skull that would exhibit something that is near gorilla, right? In terms of the primal structures or the development of the brow and different parts of the face, it's a celebration of testosterone. So based on a knowledge of the skull or a modification of the head shape, you could start to push and pull these things. Maybe I just, instead of developing the whole skull, maybe I just go on top of my template form and start to push these shapes out. Like that's the brow. What does creating that massive brow do for the rest? Having such a heavy brow makes the eye feel smaller. Maybe making the eye feel smaller makes a face feel less intelligent. So it definitely creates this massive overhang of bone. So that's a component part of forming the shape. This would be like a secondary concern inside the shape of the head that we developed, is what are the smaller parts doing to support and embellish that? There's really small eyes. So there's less maybe of an emotional connection by the lack of eye there. The nose is kind of crowded, right? That brow is so heavy. It kind of comes down what would be the normal proportions of a face. And even that nose feels a little bit higher to me. So maybe I take that normal halfway position I would use for a nose and start to slide it up. Maybe that lives up here now. I barely like it. There's like a tiny eye back here. Really short and then really broad again. So that the cheek to me feels very broad. So that would be doubled over here underneath that, or even kind of under the eye in this one, which blocks our connection to it even more so. And then really large mouth, or I should say denture sphere, which would be another result of a lot of testosterone. Really broad jaw, really thick denture sphere, really wide back corner, small ear. And then let's just form out kind of the mass of this jaw shape. And then pretty intense chin. So trying to stay short of doing like a skull lecture or a skull drawing, and just picking up the things from the skull that I know from doing head construction studies to throw them into character. So this could be the benefit of doing a construction study, is you learn some things about the skull that you choose to embellish in later versions of a character, or play down if it's not something that's monstrous and kind of gorilla-like. And then that could even trickle into certain qualities of anatomy that you may notice around the face or the skull. But for big shapes and forms, I'll probably stop somewhere short of this. The way I think about muscles generally is the same that I introduced the figures, right? In the way that we've been building them up here. Anatomy for me is always, it has to be somewhat interesting and somewhat fun. It has to be the same. I think of it first as a shape or a part. So just like you could almost just copy the last process workflow we looked at. Think of anatomy as having three steps: shape or part, second, gesture, and then third could be perspective. For example, the shape of your pectoralis, what is it as an abstract design? I know that in anatomy books it looks like hamburger with lines in it, and it's red, and it's always in the same pose. I don't know that that's useful. It wasn't for me. What was always lost on me was the idea that no anatomy book showed how to use it. So, that's really all I did in the book that I put out, was just share how I decided to synthesize or find a bridge between how to draw books and anatomy books. I'm still looking at the same tools though. Is it a square, a circle, or a triangle? Maybe a combination. So let's say the pec, just use the same workflow that I've been looking at for figures. Maybe the pec is a square with a triangle on it. Okay? And if you get to that point, maybe you go one step further and say, right, because remember the idea of simple to complex, instead of a square with a triangle, maybe it's a goldfish. So it could be geometric, or maybe it could be more iconic as a shape. That's a good starting point. You could even use anatomy books and like really traditional renderings of anatomy to get to that point. You could start to draw over them and think about how their use, how you could design them based on that depiction. After that, though, we run into the problem of, well, the body moves around, and most anatomy books just show a front, side, and back. So every muscle has to be able to show and communicate its stretch and pinch. We've been talking about stretch and pinch quite a bit. So gesture is a function of S and C, which means if I can understand one thing about anatomy that's kind of lame, which would be insertion and connection points, where a muscle begins and ends, then you can learn about or understand or read from a book what the muscle does when a part moves. So let's say, for example, your chest starts at the sternum and then it goes to the arm, and you read a lot about how that works. Well, when those 2 points get further, you can just change the shape to show a stretch by moving and distorting the shape. So maybe the shape becomes something like this. So it could still be goldfish, maybe, but now the goldfish is pulled taut and thinned, and now with S curves as opposed to C curves. So that shows a stretch. This shows something that is pinched or neutral. So that's one way to look at it. The last way would be, you could do the same thing again. How do I orient it on a surface? That could be wrapping lines. You could build something sculpturally on top of something else, but then every single muscle also has its own contribution as far as form goes. So now we're past the point of just geometries and thinking about primitive forms. Is the muscle a ball? Is the muscle a box? Or is the muscle a cylinder? Right? And now I'd be building pieces of clay onto. So this may be the pectoralis is the goldfish that can move, but its mass is held at the bottom near the nipple line. So this is a box. It's a box in this area. So any mass to this muscle would be kind of held here, right? That's the bodybuilder area where we start to box that out. If I were drawing a female, then I would take an egg and start to kind of mold it in this area. And then if I were to stretch this, then I would want to think about how that mass moves from here to being more in this area. Maybe the pec consolidates more as a cylinder near the armpit when it's stretched up and out. So that's how I address every single muscle. It's a design problem that allows me to think about shape, how I organize shape, and then aim it at understanding something that I see. The hardest part is just moving that and putting it back on top of your mannequin.
To learn from Michael, check out his Introduction to Figure Construction and Head Construction courses on Proko.com. Both courses have hours of demonstrations, lectures, and student critiques. If you're interested, click on the links in the description. Thanks.